the Nick Winter Show, and I do the entertaining, thank you. Let's go out with something really hot for these folks. A big hit out of 77. Ah, Star Wars, nothing but Star Wars. Give me the Star Wars, don't let them end. Ah, Star Wars, if they should Star Wars, please let these Star Wars stay. And hey, how about that nutty Star Wars bar? Can you forget all the creatures in there? And hey, Darth Vader in that black and evil mask, did he scare you as much as he scared me? Ah, Star Wars, those near in Star Wars, my seventh winner up here, Star Wars!
Hey folks, David Stewart here. It's time for the long-awaited analysis of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. But rather than doing just one big video, I wanted to break it up into a couple of videos and talk about some things separately. In this video, I just wanted to talk about one extremely important thing that really needs to be thought of as being separate from a more technical and detailed sort of analysis of what went on in The Phantom Menace, and that is expectations. Because what I think you'll find with The Phantom Menace is the audience expectations played a huge role in how the movie was received and perceived by both the fan base and the audience at large. And I also think the fan expectations played a big part in how the movie ended up being made, because you make a movie for an anticipated audience and their expectations. So without further ado, let's get into it. Here we are, The Failure Menace, or how George Lucas failed to meet fan expectations in Episode 1. This is important because I think George Lucas was actually trying to meet the expectations of Star Wars fans when he made The Phantom Menace, and this is different from what Rian Johnson did in The Last Jedi, which is acknowledge and take the fan expectations and then essentially insult the fans for having those expectations, to take the story and destroy what those expectations mean to the fans. So this is a different approach. Now, I think George Lucas miscalculated to probably a great degree what fan expectations are, and I'd like to dig into that, but I do think he was attempting to meet those, and he was certainly constructing his movie with an audience in mind. He wasn't constructing it purely for his own ego, as some people believe, and I'll hopefully present some evidence for that. Before we get into it, let's talk about what expectations really are and what they mean to us as people. So the first thing, an expectation is essentially a projection of future outcomes. You expect the mail to arrive at your house at a certain time. You expect when you put your key in the transmission of your car and turn it, that the car is going to then, turn over and the engine's going to start. You expect when you push a doorbell, the doorbell's going to ring. So we are projecting future outcomes for lots of things. We expect sometimes when we go to the store a certain price on an item. Now, how those expectations are met both in life and in a story kind of can have a psychological effect on us. We can be disappointed, upset, surprised. All of these sorts of emotions are the result of us interacting with our future outcomes, our projection of future outcomes. In a story, you have a plot goal. A plot goal is what the main character is trying to accomplish, and your perception of how certain that is or how uncertain that is a big part of what controls the tension in a story, and that has to do with your projection of future outcomes. Is the hero going to succeed, or is he going to fail? How likely is it that each one is going to happen? And expectations, most importantly, are a type of bias, and we have to recognize that. It's not that you should attempt to eliminate all expectations. That's pretty much impossible. In fact, most of your life you're living within certain sets of expectations, and when those are failed to be met, the emotional reaction you have is not a bad thing. That informs you to change your projections next time around. But they are a type of bias, and they can significantly affect the way that you perceive a movie, and that can significantly then affect the way that you feel when you watch a movie, or when you're reading a magazine or reading a book or listening to a piece of music. Just as an example, if you go down to the store and you buy a Metallica record, and you have this idea of what Metallica is supposed to sound like, and you put it in the record player, and it's something extremely different. you're going to have probably a stronger negative reaction. Like if you put it in your CD player and country music comes out, you may like country music, but you may all of a sudden really hate that album because it's a country album and it defied your expectations. It didn't come to meet your expectations. And so the way that you market things has a lot to do with that, has to do with the way people want certain things to be. The way that you put things into genres has to do with this interacting with these sorts of biases. So you need to be aware that they are a type of bias, and it's really difficult sometimes to work past a set of expectation biases if they're really strongly ingrained, like they would be with a Metallica record, or in some cases a Star Wars movie. That's why when I'm trying to do critical analysis of things, I'm doing my best to rate sort of each category and do some very, very valid comparisons rather than just going by how I feel and then saying that that has some sort of numerical value. And depending on whether our expectations are met or not, that can really, really affect how we perceive the work of art, and also how our feelings react to the elements in that work of art. So the more certain the expectation, and the more powerful the emotional impact of deviation from the expectation. So you can have a great bit of surprise. Just if we go back to Star Wars 77 as an example, the original Star Wars movie. When people were going into the theaters in 1977, they didn't have a strong set of expectations for what Star Wars would be. They were expecting people, Star Wars sort of grew. It had a very small opening, and it grew to be a phenomenon because of like things like word of mouth. They're like, you got to go see this movie, it'll blow you away. So you go into the movie theater with the prior expectations of the 1970s movies and 1960s sort of impressed upon you, and then Star Wars happens, the original Star Wars movie. It's going to blow you away. It's going to completely defy what your expectations were and exceed them. It's actually really difficult to exceed somebody's expectations, especially with something that's like an experiential thing like a movie. But I think that's a big part of what made Star Wars 77 have such a big impact on people, was that it just blew their expectations away. Conversely, if you have somebody has a really high set of expectations and you fail to meet them, it's going to be really, really obvious. And in some cases, it can have a really strong negative emotional impact. Whereas, and I think this is sort of the case with the Phantom Menace, is you have a movie that has a lot of good qualities to it, but because it fails to meet the expectations in a pretty strong way, it's perceived as being much, much, much worse than it probably would be if you were to eliminate this kind of bias and sort of rate each little thing in the movie, both the story and the effects and the animations, for their own merits, and make comparisons to both modern cinema and older cinema and sort of contextualize them. In that way, I think you come up with a different picture of the Phantom Menace than if you work completely off based of your expectations in 1998 for what a Star Wars movie would actually deliver to you. Expectations can also be so powerful that the failure to meet them results in delusion or even psychosis, what some people call break with reality, a belief that one's expectations are met when they are in fact not met. See Star Wars Apologists. So in Star Wars Apologists, it's a video I made a while back talking about people constantly coming on my videos and arguing for qualities of the movie, and often in sort of fallacy type ways, saying that, like, hey, this is the first movie of a trilogy, is an example. That's not an argument for the quality of the movie. That's an argument that the quality of the movie doesn't matter. So you can see that that person is trying to construct some sort of reality that matches how they wish it to be. We call this like delusion, or in some cases denial. In a real life situation, if somebody were to suddenly die, your first emotional reaction is probably denial. They're like, this can't be happening. This didn't happen. I have to look for some other way to explain why this is being announced to me and what the mistake is and how that mistake could have been made. But when we see it with, like, maybe, Force Awakens, I actually saw this with a lot of people with Force Awakens, is that they worked very hard to try to make that Star Wars movie good because they believed so powerfully that it would be good, that essentially they convinced themselves it was good. This is something that happens when expectations are not met in a very profound way. And it's probably unhealthy to have that sort of reaction. That means you have too much psychic attachment to an expectation, particularly with a work of art. It's kind of like if somebody expects to has a really high set of expectations about winning a competition, and then they don't win it, how do you react to that? Do you say, well, I was the true winner, and go on like that? Or do you have some sort of other self-referential thing? There's a whole process that people go through when they suffer massive disappointment in their lives. And one of those reactions is denial, that the thing that disappointed them didn't actually happen. And so I think that a lot of people can convince themselves that something that didn't meet their expectations, in fact, did, because they want so much for something to meet those expectations, and something that you can see in other psychological phenomena. And I'm not saying that everyone who likes Force Awakens is suffering from psychosis or something like that. You can like it for reasons other than the people who disliked it. That's possible. And although I think there's some people who are slightly psychotic, I did get people who said that they were going to find me and kill me for what I said about Force Awakens, which is really bizarre and kind of indicative of how unhealthily people can psychically attach to certain things. So expectations also can be difficult to predict in other people. I've talked about the theory of mind and the importance of that, thinking about other people have other perspectives and feelings that are different from yours. When you make a work of art, you're making it usually with an audience in mind, and I think The Phantom Menace is no exception, and I think Force Awakens wasn't an exception for sure. I think Force Awakens was really playing heavily to some of the expectations that were really, really missed, the big misses in episode 1, 2, and 3. They're difficult to predict because other people are not you. So your expectations and your desires and what you want to see, you kind of understand that they're different than someone else's. So you kind of have to use a lot of information to synthesize what other people's expectations are going to be for something. People really liked these movies. I'll make a movie that's like them, but maybe present something a little bit different that I think will also affect this audience. And if it doesn't work out, that means you've made some sort of error either in the execution of what you did or in constructing the idea itself, which I think is the case in Phantom Menace. I think it has execution flaws, and then it has some big flaws in the way it was constructed at the ground level to meet expectations. They are difficult to predict. However, within genres and franchises, expectations are tied to idioms of the style. So if you go pick up a heavy metal record, you're going to expect to hear like distorted guitar, fast drums, and depending on the style, like if it's like black metal or something like that, you're going to hear some vocal styles that you expect. And if you don't, meet those, then somebody's going to say, well, that doesn't belong to that genre. Why is it here? Why is this in science fiction when it's a romance novel? Things like that. And when you have a long franchise, I mentioned Fast and the Furious at various points. Fast and the Furious, it's a car chase movie. And so if you had a Fast and the Furious movie without car chases, or maybe even one that was like based on boats, people might find that really, really annoying. So if you're constructing it for the audience of Fast and the Furious, of course you're going to have car chases. And that's going to be true of Star Wars as well. The problem is, I think George Lucas may have predicted the wrong idioms, the wrong pieces of the style, and the wrong pieces of his franchise, and presenting when constructing the prequels to present to the fans that he already had from the original trilogy. So what were the fan expectations? I'm gonna say these were some of them, because these were a lot of mine. I was a fan of the original trilogy prior to episode 1 coming out. I watched episode 1 2 times in theaters before I decided that I didn't like it and there was something wrong with it. And so the first fan expectations, I'm going to go through all the categories really. So there was an aesthetic expectation. There was expectations for how the effects were going to look, because Star Wars is a big special effects franchise. Certain idioms of the franchise, and as well as the way characters are going to be and how attached to the characters you are. Remember, in the original trilogy, you had Luke, Han, and Leia, 3 extremely strong, very relatable characters that people really, really had strong attachments to. And then they also liked a lot of the auxiliary characters, and they loved the villain of Darth Vader. In fact, since the original trilogy, there's been a constant push to make Darth Vader a greater villain than he even was in the original trilogy. And I think you could see that with Rogue One. There were story goals as well that fan expectations had. And they also had an expectation that the movie was going to make them feel a certain way. The first one with the aesthetics was the used universe, the lived-in universe. When you look at the Millennium Falcon as a set of aesthetics, There's no smooth surfaces on it. It seems like it's constructed out of wires and all sorts of other different kinds of machinery. And you see that aesthetic kind of replicated all over the place. And I talked about this in my Why Star Wars is Awesome video. You look at the Death Star, there's no smooth surfaces anywhere. Everything's jagged, everything's angular. That's part of the visual design that really made Star Wars look cool at the time. There's a complexity to when you see a Star Destroyer kind of going past the camera, and there's so many details you can't even take them all in. That's part of the aesthetic. They wanted effects that were like the original trilogy, and that's going to be normal. Keep in mind, in 1998, CG was kind of a new thing. So the expectation is that you're going to see special effects that are really like the ones that wowed you back in the 70s and 80s. You're also going to expect battles and lightsabers. 2 of the original 3 movies had space battles, and 2 of the original 3 movies had ground battles, and all 3 had something with lightsabers, some sort of fight with lightsabers. You're going to expect your heroes, and you're going to mostly expect your heroes to be based on a couple of the archetypes from the original. You had Luke as an everyman, and then you had Han as sort of the redeemable bad boy. And you had Leia as a strong female protagonist with like a noble background. You're also going to expect the story goals to be about some of the things in the original trilogy, which is mostly about conquering evil. That the main focus of the story in the original trilogy was rebels fighting a more powerful evil empire. And so I think it was natural for most fans to bring those expectations into the prequel trilogy. And of course, that feeling of wonder and excitement that people felt when they first saw Star Wars. When a new Star Wars movie comes out, people are really wanting a replication of that feeling. But is that a good expectation? What did George think the expectations really were? And I don't fault him necessarily for thinking this, based on the way the market had treated the IP in the 15 years between Return of the Jedi and the release of Episode 1. So I think he knew that the market wanted space battles. That's an important idiom. I think he knew that they wanted lightsaber duels, which is an important idiom, and he delivered both of those. And in fact, the lightsaber duel in Episode 1 is, by a lot of fans, considered the best one in the franchise. He also thought that people wanted new and exciting planets, which he did deliver. Naboo is a really interesting planet with like a water core and 2 different races of people that kind of live side by side, and it's a verdant garden world rather than, the desert planets and ice planets that you've seen sort of in the past. And he's also wanting to show new and exciting visual effects, things people hadn't seen before, and certainly Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, delivers a lot of those. But is that the same as the expectations that the audience had? The audience, I think, was expecting to see the visual effects similar to the original trilogy, and what they got were visual effects that were very different. They were CG'd rather than a lot of little movable, like stop motion models. The question is, which one of those is superior? And I'll talk about this when I get into the more detailed analysis. But I think my more recent viewing of Episode 1 leads me to believe the CG stuff is superior in almost every circumstance to the little miniature stop motion stuff. And the miniatures looked great for the time. However, you can really see them, especially if you go watch like the old VHSs, how jittery they were. It's much the CG with its smooth animation is really much more convincing overall than the models were. But there's something kind of cool of seeing a real model. It kind of moves the way that you would kind of expect a real object to. So the CG wasn't perfect in Episode 1, but it was actually, I think, really, really good. But I get why people were like, oh, the prequels were this horrible CG fest full of terrible CGI. Well, their CGI in if you compare it to modern CGI is pretty much just as good. It's maybe not quite as good as like the most modern CGI stuff you see like in Last Jedi or whatever recent Marvel movies. However, it was really, really amazing for the time, better than anything anyone had seen before, and in my opinion, better than a lot of the practical effects of the past. And there were still lots of practical effects in Episode 1. There was aliens that were real, that were puppets. There were lots of things like that people tended to overlook because they weren't used to seeing CGI. It was one of those things that there was a little bit of an uncanny valley because people hadn't adjusted to seeing those kind of effects in the theater. And going back to new and exciting planets, I think fans wanted the planets that they were used to seeing, like places like Tatooine, which you actually do visit in episode 1, are so built up in the minds of people and attached to the idea of Star Wars. George Lucas showing a new shiny planet may have really put a lot of people off. The other thing, before I get to these franchise idioms with the battles, if we look at just the aesthetics of Naboo is really beautiful. You go into the city and it's really pristine and it's got classic architecture and all this sort of stuff going for it. We'd never seen that in a Star Wars movie before. So one of the objections a lot of my friends had is like the ships are all new and shiny. It's like, well, what do you expect a queen of an entire planet to travel in? The Millennium Falcon, which everyone always refers to as a bucket of bolts? Or would she fly around in like a brand new awesome spaceship? And probably fly in an awesome spaceship. But that contrasts with the original aesthetic of this sort of lived-in galaxy, the lived-in technology that you got in the original trilogy. And I don't think George was wrong to pursue a more classical aesthetic and a more beautiful aesthetic for Naboo, but I think fans didn't quite know what to make of that, and I think it fits the story. But again, it kind of goes across expectations. Now, George also knew that he needed to put certain kinds of structural idioms into his movie. So he begins the movie with a fight. The Jedi are ambushed on the Trade Federation ship, and then escape. And if you look at the original trilogy, all three of them begin with some sort of fight. You have Darth Vader attacking Leia's ship, you have the fight on Hoth, and then you have Luke Skywalker rescuing Han. So he began in the same way because that's something that was very characteristic of those movies. Then you also have a midpoint battle. In the original Star Wars movie, it was sort of escaping from the Death Star. In Empire Strikes Back, it was sort of what happens when they end up getting captured by Darth Vader. It's really, we call it a midpoint. It really happens closer to the end of the movie than the middle of the movie. But it's this moment where all the characters have to readjust what they're doing. In Episode 1, that midpoint battle was actually the pod racing scene. And the pod racing scene taken on its own is quite like a visual achievement. However, it didn't serve quite the same function as those other midpoint battles did. But he did put one in because he knew that people expected something like that. And then he put in a final space battle and a lightsaber duel happening at the same time, just like there was in Return of the Jedi, to really like hype up the climax and really make it very tense at the end. And you actually see this exact thing replicated in the newer Star Wars movies too. Force Awakens has this exact same 3 points that happen. It begins with a fight with Kylo Ren coming down and slaughtering a bunch of people with the stormtroopers. There's a midpoint battle, and then which is going to be them attacking like Han on that planet. And then of course there's a final space battle with them attacking the new Death Star with a lightsaber duel happening at the same time. So they really just kind of took these idioms that George established and used them again. So I don't think he was wrong to have these, and I think he probably would have fulfilled expectations with them, but people didn't notice that they did that because that's just standard. Once something is set as the standard, you expect it, but you no longer are actively looking to be fulfilled by it. That's another problem with expectations. He also put in a comic relief sidekick. And if you look at the original trilogy, the comic relief sidekick was C-3PO. And I think he's effective in that regard. C-3PO is very neurotic instead of what Jar Jar was, which was annoying. So he still put that in there because he knew people expected that, but he may have missed the mark on that iteration, what he did with it. And he wanted to put in an everyman character, a paragon, and a frightening villain. The paragon is Qui-Gon Jinn. The everyman, of course, is Anakin, who's literally nobody. He's a slave, kind of conceived by the Force. And then the frightening villain is Darth Maul. And the execution with each of these three, I think you may agree, has some flaws with it. And then what he thought that fans wanted was an exposition of deep lore, because the prequels were sort of a set of all the lore that established what was the universe as it was in Episode 4, or the original Star Wars 77. However, if we look at the original trilogy movies, I think you'll see that the background, the lore, is not nearly as important as just showing things as they are. So George just showed things as they were in the original Star Wars, and then people figured out, the evil empire is evil, and they're doing evil things. Gotcha. let's watch the story, right? And they didn't really need, well, how did the Empire begin? The reason we kind of need in the newer movies, like where did the First Order come from, is because we've watched prior movies that have kind of ended on a particular note, and there's nothing else between there to explain them. George thought that people needed a lot of this background, and they wanted to explore the lore about how the Republic worked. And I think fans were just not as interested in that as he thought they were. And the reason that I think he thought that is that you have to keep in mind there was 15 years between the release of Return of the Jedi and Episode 1. And in that time, you had the huge explosion of extended universe novels, toys, games, all that kind of stuff was going on in the market. And that's providing a lot of market feedback to him that Star Wars fans really care about exploring the lore of Star Wars, the deep universe, the setting of Star Wars itself, rather than just the sort of archetypical story that he told in the original trilogy. So let's talk about some of George's big misses when it comes to fan expectations. The first and biggest one, in my opinion, the most important one, and I talked about this in this email, was a child actor. Having Anakin be a child in the movie had a profound impact in the way the movie ended up being constructed. So the first thing is, when you have a child actor, it limits some of your relatability. And it makes his participation in the plot less believable, because a child is less capable than an adult. We tend to believe less the things he's able to accomplish. Having a child win this pod race, build a C-3PO, and then George is aware of how the child is not that believable. So in the final space battle, he has the child accidentally blow up this droid control ship rather than act of his own competence. And that is basically a big signal, if George had felt that way, that he should have probably reshot a big portion of the movie with an older actor and just made Anakin older. Now, I know why he made Anakin a child is that he wanted Anakin to have this psychological crisis about his mother and be very attached to his mother. And that probably wouldn't happen if it was an older child. So you end up kind of altering a huge amount of what is believable in order to make one element believable, when it probably would have been easier to say, well, he's attached to something. Can we just make that attachment different? Like maybe he has younger siblings, right? Uncle Owen, he's got his younger brother Owen he has to take care of, or something like that. There's lots of ways you could have done the same thing, but George chose to make it a child actor. Other problems with the child actor is that Jake Lloyd's had a very bad personal life since making Episode 1, but he was really bad in this movie. He was very, very bad at delivering his lines. It was a total miscast, and after they shot a couple of scenes, they should have gone back to the drawing board and said, we need to change this. This kid's just not working out. It's not going to be believable when we see it on screen. All kinds of weird little lines that are delivered terribly, like, yippee! Or, are you an angel? And that actually brings me to another problem with the child actor, which is that you have this beginning of a romance between Padme and a child Anakin, and it feels very pedophilic. And now I know that people will tell me that Padme was 14 at the time, which leads me to question, how did she become elected queen of a whole planet at 14? That's bizarre. You think the U.S. electorate is dumb. Apparently not nearly as dumb as Naboo. But she appears to be an adult, and Jake Lloyd's character, Anakin, appears to be a little kid. So when you see them kind of flirting and him saying, like, are you an angel? You get this kind of icky feeling about it. So I think if George had just gone with a young adult actor that could have had his own set of competencies, like maybe Anakin was, a later teenager or a young man, who was really skilled at pod racing and like pod raced for money or something, then you'd have a much more believable character. You could have believed his competency in participating in the final battle. And you also could have hired a really good actor to play him, which would have made all the delivery of some of the badly written dialogue better. A good actor can actually deliver bad dialogue really well. And I think I've seen that pretty much proven to me with the latest Star Wars movie, where you had good actors. Whoa, that character, I perceive him being more convincing, and then bad actors who can't sell the bad dialogue. So if they had changed that one thing, I think you would have had a huge increase in the amount of acceptance of the fan base of the movie. People say, well, I didn't want to watch a kids movie. Well, George is like, well, these were always kids movies. Yes, but not quite in the way that he ended up iterating this one, having an actual child actor. Remember, young kids can look at Luke Skywalker and appreciate him. But adults can't look at a hyper-competent Jake Lloyd and appreciate him. They're just going to be like, that dumb kid couldn't do that. He becomes kind of a Mary Sue, even though he's way less of a Mary Sue than Rey, because he doesn't use the Force the way Rey does within like several days of learning about it. The other problem is he had a paragon as the main character. So the main character is actually Qui-Gon Jinn, not Obi-Wan Kenobi, who's his learner, not Anakin Skywalker. None of the characters have any growth because the main character doesn't need to do any growing. That is Qui-Gon Jinn. And usually you have the paragon as an assistant to the main character, the way Obi-Wan was to Luke, a guide to help him grow and accomplish his destiny. And I think fans were expecting some sort of iteration of that, rather than watching Qui-Gon, a paragon, walk around. But I think George actually thought fans wanted to see powerful Jedi being powerful, being paragons. And I actually don't mind Qui-Gon as the main character. I think he's very effective as the main character. But I think you're not going to get any character growth, and I think fans maybe wanted that. And then the really big miss that most people are going to point to is Jar Jar. Now, Jar Jar is clearly a role for C-3PO. If they had just had Jar Jar, if they just had C-3PO, like C-3PO, I don't know who he could have owned him, but if you said, we're going to have C-3PO, I think people would have accepted the annoying sidekick a lot more. Because what you got with Jar Jar, besides him being obviously CG, which I guess some people had a negative reaction to at first, is you had him not cute, talk in a weird, annoying voice, and I'll link a video down below that explains why a lot of people found Jar Jar particularly annoying. But he's also stupid instead of neurotic, and that's the difference between C-3PO. C-3PO is constantly nervous and anxious all the time about things that are going on around him. And that's funny to us. Especially when we see a robot doing it. It's kind of a weird mixture of human traits that we kind of put upon that robot and find him kind of cute, even though he's, doesn't look like a human. I think with Jar Jar, you got like an uncanny valley of cuteness. You had this bug-like thing with eyes above his head. You had him talking stupidly instead of being neurotic, and it just did not end up having the kind of comedic effect that I think George Lucas wanted it to have. So I think that was the big miss. And I think if you had changed those three things, in fact, if you made Anakin older and made Jar Jar C-3PO, or just not had him, I think people would have really liked episode 1 a lot more than they did. And I think that reflexively would have altered the way that you constructed the movie to make pretty much everything more believable and have worked better than what it ended up doing. There's some little misses too. The first little miss is really the midichlorians. A lot of people talk about how they don't like the midichlorians. I think that this would have been a lot more forgivable had the big things been addressed. People would have just been like, oh, midichlorians, okay, that's cool, I guess. They wouldn't have said, well, that's why the movie sucks. But it becomes just another thing on the list of why people didn't end up liking the movie. So the midichlorians were basically a MacGuffin for Anakin to be the chosen one. It was a way for them to explain how Anakin was the chosen one. And the problem was George didn't perceive how that would change people's reaction to the Force. Made the Force into like this quantifiable thing rather than a vast spiritual amorphous idea, an idea of magic and spiritual religious magic, I guess is what you would call it. And made it into something that's a little more quantifiable, which people didn't like. They liked the Force being mysterious. And this is also something that you can look at with fantasy. There's two kinds of people that look at magic with fantasy. People who look at hard magic systems, like what Brandon Sanderson does, that are very, very well defined, and people who like softer magic systems. And my fantasy novels actually contain a little bit softer magic system because I want magic to feel wondrous and magical. I want limits to be easily defined so that characters are in danger, especially if you have main characters that use magic. But if you make magic completely well defined, it becomes a little bit less exciting. And I think Disney picked up on this, and they didn't realize that you have to hem in magic systems no matter what, especially if your main characters are using them, to provide the danger that's necessary for there to be tension in the plot. So midichlorians were a little miss. There's a lot of expositional dialogue. This has to do with the sort of execution of the movie. the expositional dialogue is there to explain the lore of Star Wars, which is what George Lucas thought people wanted a lot of. And I think what people really wanted was action and a strong story rather than a lot of explanation of how the Republic works or these sorts of things. You have droids instead of stormtroopers as the bad guys. This is a little one. But stormtroopers, notice they wear a mask. They're dehumanized. That's why you have fleets of stormtroopers that you can just mow down. People don't look at them as humans. They're dehumanized because they're wearing a mask. And that's important. I think George would consider that important because these movies were made for younger audiences as well as older audiences. If you had a fleet of people with faces that got shot and be like, no, I'll never see my son grow up. That is not quite the feeling that you want to give people, is that the heroes are killing people who have thoughts and emotions of their own. Stormtroopers are basically robots. They look like robots. They talk. They have sort of generic dialogue. Stop, rebel scum. But they don't look like people, and that's what matters. So instead of having stormtroopers, because he's like, we need to do something, this is before the Empire, so let's do droids. Now they do the same sort of thing, except he gave them some kind of like comedic dialogue. They're like, Roger, Roger, and they're a little bit more cutesy. However, that's a miscalculation of the execution. If he'd made the droids really scary looking, I think people would have liked him better. He gave people a pristine, beautiful world of Naboo instead of a dark and twisted set of worlds with very complex looking aesthetics like what we saw in the original trilogy. Now, I think he was going for more kind of what you see in like Cloud City, which is a really beautiful place. And he wanted to do a classical version of that, and that's what you get with Naboo. And I think it's really beautiful. However, because we start the movie with that, I think people were really looking to see more like kind of dark stuff. And I actually do think that there's part of the Star Wars fan base that really only likes Empire Strikes Back, and they just want it to be dark all the time. But anyway, there was no character growth. I talked about this with the choice of characters. So nobody really gets any better or worse at what they're doing. You do have Obi-Wan, who becomes a Jedi at the end, and he has a little bit of character growth, but not much. And if Obi-Wan had been made the real protagonist and had a strong growth, or if Anakin had been made the real protagonist, Anakin doesn't get better or worse at anything across the course of the movie, and neither does Padme. So there's no character growth, which means you're going to have less attachment to the characters. What makes people get attached to the characters is not just their personalities, but the way those personalities end up doing things in a plot. What they're able to accomplish makes you a little bit more attached to them. And then George decided to talk about complex politics rather than large and easy to understand conflicts. This idea of like the politics of the Republic preventing peace on Naboo, and the senator who becomes, of course, Palpatine, or becomes the Emperor, the evil Darth Sidious, playing both sides in order to give himself political power. I think that was a really cool story. However, it was really different from what the original trilogy was, so I think people tended to reject it or just weren't prepared to take in that set of conflicts and understand what was going on there. So rather than having big moral conflicts, we have lots of weird little politics. And of course, if you consider Star Wars to not be about that, you're going to be a little bit kind of blindsided by the inclusion of politics. The midpoint battle, this is just a little thing, the pod racing, is more like a game than a movie, and it's also full of some of the most cringy thing, in my opinion, in the movie is actually the announcer at the pod racing event. So it plays more like a game than a movie. I think it can be exciting, and it's certainly very visually stimulating, but it doesn't quite work the way of the other midpoint battles. We have something at stake, which is Anakin's freedom, but we're not like escaping from enemies that are trying to kill us. So I think the midpoint battle was a little bit of a miss, and that's up to your opinion, but I think that was a miss. So, was George wrong about his set of expectations? Obviously, I've proven that he was wrong in assuming what the fans wanted. But was he wrong with his whole construction of the movie? In a lot of ways, I don't think he was. So first of all, the key elements of the Phantom Menace are used for the next 20 years in cinema and blockbuster movies. That's big CGI battles at the end, concurrent battles to sort of fulfill a climax, the use of CGI, the way the CGI is framed and used in the way it's shot. The inclusion of CGI characters ended up just sort of being iterated in Lord of the Rings. So a lot of the stuff that he did ended up being used in the next 20 years in blockbusters, but people didn't have the negative reactions that they have to this one because those expectations ended up being quite a bit different. If you change the big misses into little better executed things, like changed the child actor into an adult, I think a lot of people would have overlooked all the little misses. They would have been okay with some cringy dialogue. They would have been okay with the exposition. They would have been okay with the political story if those characters had been better, because what people really attach themselves to are characters. And the Phantom Menace, because of the fan reaction, it informed what George Lucas did in the next two movies. Notice there's no Jar Jar in those two. But those two movies are not super well loved either by the fan base, and I think maybe Phantom Menace had poisoned the well to a certain extent at that point. Disney picked up on that and really went and made Episode 7 really hit the expectations that George missed in Phantom Menace really, really hard, and I think that's why a lot of people had a positive reaction to it. I did not have a positive reaction to it, though, because by this point, by the time Force Awakens came out, I wasn't searching for the original trilogy again. I have the original trilogy. I can watch it, I was looking for something new, and meeting those expectations, however close they may have met them in Episode 7, didn't make up for the fact that Episode 7 didn't have any kind of core to it. It didn't have a good story. It didn't have any meaning behind the story, which Phantom Menace had meaning behind the story. It was really about the rise of power of Palpatine playing both sides, and the discovery of Anakin, and lots of little things. Five different little threads of plots going on at the same time. And lastly, I think it was probably impossible to meet all of the expectations of all the fans with Episode 1 and to replicate the same feeling they had for those original Star Wars movies, particularly the original Star Wars back in 1977. Now, the thing is, you got to remember, if you guys weren't around for 1998 and Episode 1 coming out, I was in high school at the time. This was the most hyped movie of all time. It really was, in my opinion, the most anticipated movie in the history of the human race. It was more than a year of constant hype. Whenever something was on Entertainment Tonight about it, like, you would watch it. If you heard that there was going to be a trailer on, you would go see the movie just to see the Episode 1 trailer. That's how big this was. It was constant. People stood in line months ahead of time to get tickets. They had whole kinds of controversies, like, how many advance tickets can we sell? How are we going to manage this incredible movie and its gigantic hype? And so because of how hyped it was, the expectations were sky high. And the expectations were so high, I think, even if you had fixed the big things that I talked about, I think most people would have found it a little bit lacking. However, I think in the end, they probably would have said, well, I think it's an okay movie, and I think it's okay Star Wars, rather than a lot of the rejection that people had of the movie. In other words, it's smaller flaws, because the original movies had flaws as well, would have been overlooked in lieu of meeting the correct set of expectations. And because the original Star Wars movie blew people away, because their expectations were of something that they had never seen before, it was not possible, I think, to replicate those same feelings. However, I think if George had been a little bit more aware of what people wanted from Star Wars, I think you would have seen in Episode 1 that would have hit those moments a lot better, and would have left people leaving the theater feeling a lot better than they did. So that's about all I have to say about this particular movie. I hope you've enjoyed listening to this little lecture and looking at my evidence. My main thing is that I think George tried to meet expectations, but he wasn't quite aware of what the real expectations of the fans were, and so that made him make a couple of wrong decisions in the building of the movie that are really difficult to solve. Now, I'm going to point you guys to an idea that's been around basically since Phantom Menace came out, which is the idea of fan edits. There's a really popular one called the Phantom Edit. I've had people email me with some of their edits, which are really cool to watch, by the way. How an edit can kind of transform the way we perceive the movie. By cutting out certain elements that annoy people and really editing the main sort of narratives together, you can actually get a little bit better story. However, none of those edits will be as good as if they had changed the things that I talked about. If they had just made Anakin be an older character and then made the movie from that standpoint, I think the final version of Phantom Menace would have been much more acceptable, even with Jar Jar Binks. And the thing about Jar Jar Binks is that while you may find him annoying, kids actually still like him. My son thinks Jar Jar Binks is really funny. and he likes to watch the little Jar Jar Binks clips. So he'll ask them, "I want to see Jar Jar," and they'll watch 2 minutes of Jar Jar being silly, and he'll laugh at it. So it is a character made for kids, but that's because it's a silly, stupid character rather than what you had with C-3PO as a neurotic character. Neurosis is funny to adults. Stupidity is funny to children. And so that was a big misstep on George's part. And if you'd fixed both of those two things, I think you would have ended up with a movie that a lot of people liked better than what ended up coming out. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I do have books that are available. The Needle Ash books are out and, been continually updated. So make sure you're getting those. And if you're on my mailing list, you'll get copies of those, and you can still get them, or you can get them in paperback, and they're pretty cool. And I will make some videos just talking about sort of what I did with these, some of the illustrations that are in them, and the guy who drew the pictures, as well as how I made these covers, because I did design these covers myself. So I'm pretty happy with them. It's a fun little fantasy story, and I hope you'll enjoy it. If you do check it out, please leave a review, and that helps me out a lot. And I'll see you guys next time.